All right, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Jen Judson, the 115th president of the National Press Club and the land warfare reporter for Defense News. Today we're joined by Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall. We're accepting questions here at the National Press Club and via email at headliners@press.org. If you'd like to submit a question, please put Air Force in the subject line. We also have cards circulating around the audience and at a table out front if you'd like to fill those out, and just bring them up to me whenever you're ready. While turmoil in Europe commands our attention as Ukraine attempts to defend itself against a Russian invasion, the US military also has its focus further east, benchmarking its capabilities against what it perceives as a more potent threat, China. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall earlier this month called China's modernization program the greatest challenge to the Defense Department's ability to perform its missions. Although Secretary Kendall identified China as the department's pacing challenge, he also called Russia an acute threat. The Department of the Air Force, now in its 75th year, has asked Congress for $194 billion in 2023, a hefty increase that Secretary Kendall has said will help transform the Air Force into a fighting force that keeps pace with China's rapid modernization. His vision includes a combination of manned and unmanned aircraft and more aggressive defensive capabilities for space-based weapons. Secretary Kendall, a graduate of the US Military Academy at West Point, has a long history in the defense field, having worked as a consultant to the defense industry, nonprofit research organizations, and the Defense Department. He is also an attorney active in the field of human rights. We are delighted to have Secretary Kendall here today to outline the Air Force's FY23 budget request and to share his plans for the department's transformation to meet future threats around the globe. Sir, welcome to the National Press Club. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jen, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for being with me this afternoon. I'm going to set some context for our budget, and I'll be testifying before the Congress shortly. But I thought it'd be useful to kind of lay out how we got to where we are and where we're trying to go. I came back into government after being gone for 4 years because of my concerns about the threats to our ability to project conventional power, conventional military power. And I still have those concerns, and if anything, in the last several months since I've been back in office, they've been amplified in a number of regards. The budget we have submitted, it contains what I would call, first of all, an appropriate balance between immediate or near-term capabilities and investments in the future. Those investments in the future are designed to transform the Department of the Air Force. And we're started down a path which is going to be a reasonably long path. We have a long ways to go on this. And I've started a number of initiatives to try to define in more detail that path to guide further investments. But more investments are going to be required. And the transformation is going to be somewhat significant. The other watchword, if you will, that I'm providing to the Congress as we go forward is that hard choices are ahead. We did increase our research and development account by a substantial amount. It's the biggest growth in our budget. It's about 20% higher than the previous submission. And that's a down payment on future capabilities. So why are those future capabilities needed? They're needed because of the threat. And the pacing challenge, as Jen mentioned, is China. Russia is also, of course, an acute threat and a concern. But as we just saw, Russia's military is not as capable as it might be, has significant deficiencies. And just to put things in context, the entire defense budget of the United States of America, at about $770 billion, is 50% of the Russian gross domestic product, 50% of their entire economy. It's less than 5% of the economy of China. And that's why one of the many reasons why I consider China to be the pacing challenge, the pacing threat, and the one I'm focused on most when I think about modernization of the Department of the Air Force. The R&D investment increase that I talked about is a down payment on the future. It's the first payment of what's going to come. Transformations are not cheap. So there are going to be some hard choices ahead, but the threat is increasing over time. So to keep that balance correct going forward, we are going to have to make some hard choices, even at any conceivable budget that I think might come out of the Congress. So I want to make sure that people are prepared for that to come in the future. So where are those hard choices going to be made? Where is that transformation necessary? When you look at the missions that the Air Force, the Department of the Air Force has, and start with the strategic mission, strategic deterrence, we're actually in pretty good shape. We have the ground-based strategic deterrent, the ICBM replacement, now known as Sentinel, fully funded in the budget. We have the B-21 bomber, the other of the two legs of the triad that we're responsible for, fully funded, and starting to enter into production phase at this point. We have the long-range strike weapon, also in development. So that part of the portfolio, including the space-based early warning and space-based strategic communications and nuclear command and control in general, the portions of that the Air Force is responsible for are funded and well understood, and I think on a sound path. Where I'm most concerned is in our conventional deterrent, our ability to project power. The United States bases its strategy, integrated deterrence, a big element of that, on the ability to deter aggression far away from the United States, thousands of miles, whether it's in Europe or in the Western Pacific. And in Europe, we've seen very recently that potential is real, that acts of aggression do happen, and you've seen a united reaction to that by NATO and our other allies. You've also seen some of the limitations of Russian forces. In the Pacific, we have a different situation. The situation in the Pacific has been evolving for about 30 years now. It started with the first Gulf War. China, probably more than any other country, noticed how America demonstrated dramatic conventional warfare power projection capability. And they learned from that. And one of the things they learned from that is the things that we are dependent upon to project power. And that's a small number of high-value assets, whether they're satellites in orbit, aircraft carriers that have to deploy forward or forward air bases, or command and control and logistics nodes as well. And they built the systems to attack those assets, largely conventional ballistic and cruise missiles, more recently hypersonics. And they built the systems to support those systems, provide targeting information for them and so on, including space systems. So for 30 years, China has been working to build this capability, and they continue to do so. When I came back into government this time, after being gone for 4 years, I looked at what had happened to threats. It's similar to my reaction 12 years ago when I came back in 2010. The threat has continued to evolve, and in fact, it's thinking ahead. It's not only thinking about how to defeat our 5th generation capability, but how to defeat our 6th generation capability that we haven't even fielded yet. Hypersonics are an addition to their capability. And they're a growing suite of space-based capabilities, both on the offensive side and the defensive side, are also formidable and becoming more so over time. So our challenge is to identify how to transform and how to move forward, and then to do so as quickly as possible. To organize our work, I'm using, in the conventional power projection area, I'm using 7 operational imperatives. These are things we have to do to be able to project power. And I'll go through the list very, very quickly. It could take a long time to cover that, but I won't do that today. First is get the space order of battle right. We have to protect the services we provide from space. Currently and traditionally, we provide them from a relatively small number of fairly easily targetable satellites. So we have to transition to more resilient architectures. In the 23 budget, we start that with missile warning and with communications. But we have other facets of our performance from space that we also need to make more resilient. We're working with the intelligence community on the things that we do together from the intelligence and the operational point of view. And we're working with others on the needs that the other parts of the joint force have to make sure that we satisfy all of those needs. We also need to deny the Chinese the ability to target our forces from space. I refer to the Space Force as sometimes as the great enabler. It's also the great protector. It protects the rest of the joint force. It protects them in particular from targeting from space. And if we allow our adversaries to target their long-range precision weapons from space, we're at a significant disadvantage, possibly a decisive disadvantage. So we have to deal with that problem as well. Moving from there, we have to get battle management, command and control right. You've heard a lot over the last few years about joint all-domain command and control. That work needs to be focused on the modernization that we really need, that will be most cost-effective. And as I've learned after several months on the job, we have a need to recapitalize and modernize our architecture for C3 in any event. So we've got a lot of work to do there. But step one is to really define what that work is and what the most efficient path forward is. That C3 battle management architecture depends first and foremost on the acquisition of targets by sensors, preferably space-based, but sometimes air-based or with other means. Our existing systems we rely on to do this, AWACS and JSTARS, are aging and not as capable or as survivable as we'd like them to be. We would prefer to do that job on a global basis. And the best way to do that, of course, is from space. So we're going to look at options there, working closely with the intelligence community on this. And we will be, that is work still to be defined, still to be done. But we do need to modernize our ground moving and our air moving target indication capabilities. So that work is underway. In the interim, because of the age of AWACS in particular, we're moving forward with a more temporary replacement for AWACS that'll satisfy some mission needs with greater capability until we can transition to space. The next thing in the equation is attack air capabilities itself. Most of the Air Force is composed of tactical fighters that operate from forward air bases. We're moving to fulfill a program called Next Generation Air Dominance, which was started actually in the Obama administration. It's a program that I started called the Aerospace Innovation Initiative to build operational prototypes, experimental prototypes of the next generation, the sixth generation of attack air capability. That program has been relatively successful, and we're ready to build upon it. But it's not just about a platform. It's about the family of systems that we use to control the air. And we're going to introduce into that family of systems unmanned combat or uncrewed combat aircraft. This will be for the first time. But as I look at the technologies that exist, it's pretty clear to me that they are ready to support the kind of capability that is really unprecedented. And the vision here is that a next generation air dominance platform, or perhaps an F-35, will control one or more, perhaps several, uncrewed combat aircraft, and they would operate together as an operational formation. So fleshing that out, defining that, and getting on with the procurement of it is the next thing on the list. All of this that I've talked about so far doesn't work unless we can make our forward air bases resilient. So the combination of things that will protect those air bases, distribute our forces, make them harder to target, a concept the Air Force calls ACE, or Agile Combat Employment. We have to finance that, and we have to decide what the most cost-effective mix is. So we are doing some work in that area as well, but we're going to have to do more. We're going to have to be prepared to make the investments there that'll be successful. If none of this works, we still have Global Strike, Long-Range Strike, which is an important capability in any event. And so the B-21 program, which has both nuclear and conventional missions, is making good progress. But even here, we're thinking about a family of systems, which includes uncrewed combat aircraft as well, ones with range and payload capabilities comparable perhaps to the B-21. So that work to identify that is ongoing. And then last on my list is all the things we have to do to transition to war. All the things we rely upon, all the dependencies that an adversary can understand and try to attack. This includes things like our personnel system, our transportation system, our pay system, our medical systems even, the things that we use when we want to go to war and mobilize people and send them forward. Logistics nodes are in that equation. And cybersecurity is a huge part of that, but it also includes resilience to kinetic attack and other forms of attack besides cyber. So that's the list. That's where the transformation will come from. And it's a pretty extensive list, but it's brought about by what the threat is doing and how much more severe it's coming. I had a chance this morning to talk about a program with some of my staff, and they laid out a plan to acquire a next generation of capabilities that included a 21-month study period. My reaction was that that's unacceptable. We cannot move at the speed of bureaucracy. We have to move at the speed dictated by the operational reality we face. C.Q. Brown, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, used the phrase last year, accelerate change or lose. And I thought that was incredibly apt. I have another slightly different way of characterizing this, and it is that change is hard, losing is unacceptable. And with that guidance, the Air Force and the Space Forces are trying to move forward to the capabilities that they need. I want to thank the Congress for what it did last year to allow us to divest some of our older aircraft that are increasingly not operationally effective and more expensive to maintain. The average age of our aircraft in the Air Force right now is 30 years. Nobody in the room, I think, or listening has a 30-year-old car unless it's an antique that you value highly and is one of your prized possessions. But for normal operations, that's not what we rely upon. And the Air Force can't either. So we need cooperation from the Congress. I spoke to a group of new leaders in the Air Guard this morning, and I posed to them the problem of, identifying the things that are going to ensure the future and provide the defense for the country that we really need. And it isn't hanging on to old airplanes just because you've had them and you don't want to let go of them. We have to move forward. So that's basically the bottom line of what we're about, what the Air Force is about. We're doing a number of other things, but my focus, my obsession almost, I think, is the modernization program in China. I came back into government partly because I think I have a different perspective than most people, and it's associated with my age and my previous experience. I spent 20 years as a Cold Warrior. I graduated from West Point in 1971 and spent the next roughly 20 years working in some facet of national security, either in uniform or in civilian clothes. And I was involved in research and development fundamentally. And at that time, we were in a contest for technological superiority. The Soviet Union had good scientists and engineers. It was terrible at manufacturing, but it had good scientists and engineers. And it made reasonable investments in its defense apparatus. And they surprised us at times. I know what it's like to have a peer competitor who is actively trying to defeat you. And most of the people in uniform today don't have that experience. Very few of them have any of it, if any, a few years perhaps. It gives you a different mindset. And if there were one thing I'd like to inculcate in the Department of the Air Force, it's a sense of urgency about moving forward and dealing with these threats. And I would say the same about the Congress. When I talk to the Congress, it's going to be important to communicate, and I hope I'm successful at this because a lot depends on it. But we have to move forward. We can't stand still. We can't hang on to what we have. We've got to get to the next generation capability. We have a capable adversary who is studying us every day. Right now is studying what's happening in the Ukraine and learning from that. And they will move forward. They've shown the ability to be strategic in their investments. They've shown the ability to be creative in the types of forces they create, which in many cases are very non-traditional. And we have to be willing to do the same. And I'm confident if we do that we can prevail. But it's a necessity if we are going to prevail. With that, I'll stop and take your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for your opening remarks. A lot to dive into here. I have a lot of questions already filtering in from defense reporters all over Washington. But to start, the DoD has made it clear it's all about shifting to this high-end fight against near-peer adversaries. And for the Air Force, that means a far less permissive air environment than you've encountered in the Middle East, for example. So how is the Air Force changing to respond to the higher-end threat environment with less permissive air environment?
Well, we're looking very closely at a lot of the systems I talked about. The 7 operational imperatives tend to be all focused on that one way or the other. We demonstrated what was called at the time a revolution in military affairs in 1991. I termed it a military technological revolution, but others called it by other names. And that included stealth. It included wide area surveillance systems like JSTARS, networking of our capabilities, more so than in the past, and some precision munitions, which were very much a part of that. And we demonstrated a level of dominance on a conventional battlefield against what was considered a fairly modern military from Iraq that was unprecedented. That's basically what we have today. We've modernized it in some ways. We're fielded F-22 since then, fielded F-35, we've fielded AMRAAM, we've fielded some other capabilities, and we're working on some additional things for the next generation. But it's still basically the same concept. And the people who have studied it from an adversarial point of view have figured out what we depend upon to be successful. So we have to address those things, and things that we presume to be survivable. The other problem we have, of course, is that since 9/11, we've spent our time and a lot of our energy and a lot of our intellectual capital and our physical capital dealing with counterinsurgencies and violent extremists. So the types of operations we've conducted and the types of capabilities we've needed have been very different than the ones we need for a high-end threat. Permissive environments, as you mentioned, use of not very survivable unmanned aircraft, which have been introduced to the force. Our space systems have stayed basically ones similar to the ones we had, with an assumption that we could operate in space with impunity, which we can't now. So these are all realities that we have to come to grips with and change. And there was a lot of emphasis in the previous administration on going fast. But my caution about that, and I'm all for going fast, my caution about that is that you have to go in the right direction. You have to be sure you're going in the right direction or you're just wasting time and effort. So that's what we're working on right now in part. In some cases, we've identified where we need to go and we're making the changes. The disaggregated missile warning architecture is an example of that. The disaggregated communications architecture that Space Development Agency's been working on as part of that. We're looking for replacements for the two wide area sensor programs that I talked about, trying to do space if we can, if that can be cost effective. So a number of things to do.
Okay. The 20 years of the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq put a tremendous and long-lasting strain on the U.S. Air Force, especially when it comes to long-range transport and refueling aircraft. So how are you addressing the need to rebuild and modernize that aspect?
Our mobility forces are in pretty good shape. C-17s are pretty good. C-5s are getting up there and will have to be retired before too many years go by. The tanker fleet, we're largely recapitalizing through the KC-46. The KC-135s, they're vintage 1962. I was just on one. And by contrast, I got on to KC-46, and it's kind of night and day comparison between those aircraft. They're still reliable, they're still capable, but they're getting increasingly costly to maintain. So we have KC-46s in the pipeline. We're looking right now at what happens after KC-46 and when we introduce that. And we're thinking about some changes there, driven by survivability requirements. A conventional tanker, one of the things that we depend upon, and our adversaries have figured this out, is tanking of our tactical aircraft within a few hundred miles of where they operate. And if you can attack the tankers, which are not stealthy and which are not highly defended, highly resilient, then you can have an advantage that way. So we've got to think about what our next generation will look like.
Okay. The war in Ukraine is revealing much about Russian capability. So what lessons are you taking from what you are seeing in terms of the Russian invasion in Ukraine? Are there cautionary tales from Russia's example that you're taking into account in Air Force planning?
We're all trying to learn from that. That process isn't over. The lack of professionalism, I'll put it that way, the Russian military came as a little bit of a surprise to a lot of us. The fierce resistance and the professionalism of the Ukrainian people is also exceeded what we might have expected. But when you look at the specifics of the operation, the inability of the Russians to get air superiority and to totally control the air is very interesting, and how that's hampered their ability to do ground operations. So it kind of reinforces the message that you need to control the air. Another thing that's very interesting, though, is that the reason they didn't do that in part was the ground-based air defense systems that the Ukrainians possessed and how effective they were perceived to be against the Russians, and the ability of the Ukrainians to keep them operating over time also. There are a number of other things associated with, on the land side, the effectiveness of what was a traditional mechanized force and how it could operate successfully. That's not over. They're in a very different type of terrain where they're operating now, and we may see some different results there. But the effectiveness of the weapons that we supplied, like Stinger and Javelin, I think those of us who pay attention to this sort of thing probably aren't surprised by that too much, but it's obviously become clear that those were very capable and effective weapons against the Russian force in this case. And there are a lot of other things that as we get into this, we'll get to understand more about the battle management, command and control side of things in particular, where I think the Russians had great difficulty controlling their force.
Right. Has the Ukraine crisis shown that point-winged fighters aren't actually vital to controlling an airspace? Would you, do you think the service should instead cut fighters and focus more on short-range air defense or drones, something like that?
We're not ready to walk away from some form of tactical aircraft, and we're not quite ready to fully embrace drones operating on their own. In my next generation air dominance operational imperative, I am including unmanned, uncrewed combat aircraft. Right. So I think based on the Skyberg program the Air Force has conducted, the ACE program that DARPA has conducted, the Loyal Wingman program the Australians are doing, there's enough evidence now that says that we can move forward and get through the first generation of uncrewed combat aircraft that work under human control in a formation of some size with a manned aircraft as the controlling node. So I think we're ready to move forward on that. There's still no doubt risk in that, so we have a lot more to learn. But as was indicated by the operation, and as I said earlier, control of the air still matters. It matters a great deal. It basically can deny people the opportunity to move on the ground effectively. That's the point of it. And so that's not something we would walk away from. But you have to do it well. You have to take into account the various types of defenses that you're going to face. And it's again, my Cold War experience where we would build a generation of equipment with some level of capability, and then they would build something a little better, and we would build something a little better. We're back into a race for technological superiority in military capability. And we just haven't had that experience for a long time. But that's where we are now, and we have got to be aggressive about it.
Okay. Diving a little bit deeper into Ukraine and the impact of on the defense industrial base, for instance, what steps would you recommend to ensure the defense industrial base can take the strain of supplying Ukraine, keeping the U.S. stocked and backfilling allies at once? For example, and I'm not quite sure where this is on the table or if it's off the table, but if say Poland gives MiGs to Ukraine, will the U.S. be able to backfill F-16s to Poland? What are some of the things you're considering in terms of that?
I can't go too far in the last part of that because we really haven't gotten to where we're actively considering that yet. In the initial days of the invasion, it was all about things we could do quickly, that the Ukrainians could accept and utilize quickly because they were in an immediate crisis. I don't know what the course of the conflict will be from here forward. We may be entering into a more stable phase in which things that have longer terms of preparation and training and so on would be more suitable. And even after that, I'm reasonably confident that Ukraine will remain an independent country, although we'll see how it comes out precisely. We're going to want to keep Ukraine able to defend itself. They're certainly going to want to do that for the long term. And that'll open up a number of additional possibilities that I don't think we've fully explored yet or are prepared to talk about. Most of what we've been doing so far has been about immediate needs and getting things to the Ukrainians that they can absorb logistically and absorb from an operational perspective pretty quickly and use effectively. And I think that the success of that has been evident from what's happened on the battlefield. As far as the industrial base is concerned, the industrial base will respond to whatever demands we put on it, but there are limits on what it can do. And a lot of these weapon systems have about a 2-year supply chain to get components built and then assembled into a final product. And that's a missile, for example, or a fighter plane fall roughly into that category, maybe for a missile a little bit less. So you can't turn it on instantaneously. And it would be prohibitively expensive to have all of that capability in waiting for when you have demand. That said, I think we can do a better job of thinking about and preparing for a future in conflict. I spoke to the committee the House Armed Services Committee put together a year or so ago. And the advice I gave them was don't worry so much about peacetime vulnerability of the industrial base, worry about wartime capability. And if there's a problem in peacetime, we'll fix it. The consequences won't be horrific. But if there's a problem in wartime, we're stuck. So think about things like munitions and spare parts and other things that you may need to stockpile in excess of peacetime need to have enough for wartime. And also think about the infrastructure that you have and whether it's postured to support wartime needs or not. And as we're discovering, these things can happen.
The Army is responsible for, stockpiling all the ammunition and the supply chain in the U.S. in terms of the organic industrial base. They've recently put out an implementation plan. They plan to invest about $16 billion over the course of, 10 years on this. Do you think what they have planned, if you've had a chance to dive into that at all, is enough to support wartime demands or a wartime surge at this point?
2 parts. I haven't had a chance to look at it, so I can't give you an answer yet. It would certainly be a significant improvement if we did that. I don't know whether it'd be adequate or not. I think you have to figure out how you're going to manage risk over time, which conflict you're most concerned about, and what you think an extended period of conflict would look like. What we're trying to do with the various elements of the national defense strategy is to put ourselves in a posture where we can deter effectively, so we don't get into a long conflict. And my focus in the Department of the Air Force, under that umbrella of integrated deterrence and so on, and enduring capability, is to have a force that can credibly defeat an act of aggression. And I think that's the most effective way to deter. And we just saw an act of aggression which was ground dominated. An act of aggression in the Pacific would be airspace and maritime dominated. And so you need the ability to, in a very quick period of time, bring enough force to bear to prevent the operation that the adversary is trying to conduct. So there's a decisive period measured in a small number of days probably, in which that occurs. And then if you're successful at that, you're either the conflict is basically over or it's going to go into a longer, more drawn out phase. That's what we're trying to avoid. So if we're successful at the front end of that, we don't have to worry about months or years of conflict. That would be a preferred outcome.
Okay. You triggered a question I have lined up here in your response there, but as Russia continues its unprovoked attacks on Ukraine, many fear that China may attempt a similar military action in Taiwan against the people of Taiwan. While this is considered a maritime domain, you mentioned that there's also an air element here. So can you talk a little bit about how the Air Force and even the Space Force play a role in potentially, if we had to stop China from an action like that, how you would play a role?
It's essential. I mean, it's space, air, and maritime dominated compared to Europe, which is space, air, and ground, land dominated. The objective of the Chinese, I believe, would be to keep us from intervening if they did something like that. And the way they would attempt to do that, and I'm speculating, of course, is that they would try to use things that were not lethal, cyber and electronic warfare, for example, to defeat things like our satellite systems, to keep us out of the conflict that way. They could also attack with cyber means, for example, some of our things rely upon to mobilize so that we couldn't get forces into the theater. And I talked about some of those earlier when I was talking. If that fails, then they could move to a kinetic phase where they could target our high-value assets, air bases, aircraft carriers we try to get into the region, et cetera. And so we have to defend those and be able to operate from those. So there's a hierarchy of things that I can imagine they would use. We would need to defeat those in order to just get into the fight. And once we're into the fight, we first have to control space, to deny targeting of our forces from space, and to ensure we could still get the services we need, targeting to support us as well as communications and so on. And we'd also have to defeat their ability to project both air and sea power to their objective. And the Air Force has several advantages in being a preferred weapon, if you will, to use for this. First of all, we're at forward air bases, so we're already in the region. So we have forces present. We also have long-range global strike capability. They can get there in a matter of hours, as opposed to a matter of days or weeks for maritime assets or ground assets. So we can be in the fight more quickly. We can bring a lot more combat power to the fight very quickly. And I think from the point of view of the Chinese, preventing us from doing that will be very high on their list of things to try to accomplish.
I'm going to ask one last sort of high-level question and dive into some questions from the audience, mostly dealing with procurement and weapon systems. But what is your plan for transforming the Air Force if Congress doesn't cooperate? Say, blocking aircraft retirement. We've seen that happen over and over and over. So just a little bit of your thoughts on managing that aspect.
We can't do this without Congress's cooperation. It's a necessity. Congress, at the end of the day, controls the budget, and the budget controls what we're allowed to do. So I have been spending the last several months giving a classified briefing on the threat to members of Congress. I briefed the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, a number of appropriators as well, the SACD and members of the HACD. And basically my message to them is that we do have a serious threat, and we do need your help in addressing this threat. And the point of all that is that at the end of the day, what we all should care about the most is national security. And I understand constituent interest, and we're prepared to work with individual delegations and with individual states about their concerns. But at the end of the day, we've got to find a way forward, and the Congress has got to be part of that path.
Right. This question is from Joe Morton, Washington correspondent of the Dallas Morning News. Why is the Air Force proposing to slash the number of F-35s ordered in the FY22 budget request? How do you respond to members of Congress who say that's short-sighted given global events such as the situation in Ukraine? And what will it mean for the Air Force if Capitol Hill disregards that proposal and pushes the number of F-35s back up?
Well, we had to make some difficult choices in this budget too. When we looked at the TAC Air portfolio, I had a number of things we needed to do. We needed to fully fund the next generation air dominance platform. We wanted to complete the buy of F-15EX, which is a couple more years to go now. We need to get on with some of our advanced air-to-air missiles like JATM. So we want to do those things. We still want to procure F-35, but we have limited resources. We also have the concern on F-35 about getting to Block 4. The Block 4 capability is what we really need for the pacing challenge for China, for their advanced systems. So we need to get that done, and we're well behind schedule on that right now. We've been behind schedule for a couple of years on that. So hopefully that'll come along. But we put all those things together. We lowered the procurement rate of F-35 for a couple of years, and then we ramp it back up. If there's more progress or more money, then we'd be prepared to do more there. But in the total balance of things, it was the right balance, I think, to strike for the department. We have a mix of capabilities we're trying to get to, and some of those other things. Oh, the other thing I didn't mention was the advanced engine. We're funding that too, so we need to try to get that fully funded. So when you put it all together, that was where we ended up. People have asked me if we're committed to the F-35. We've been building the F-35 for 15 years. We will build the F-35 for, I expect, another 15. We're committed. It's the cornerstone of the fighter force.
Can't go back now. The F-35 is set to become the fighter plane of choice for many allies, much like the F-16 has been for decades. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing an eagerness on the part of allies to upgrade their forces with the F-35, or is this cost too high?
The F-35 is selling itself. Its capabilities are selling it. And it's interesting that all the original partners are still in. Canada was on the fence for a while, and they've, I think, committed again now. We're seeing other companies. We've had I don't want to get into details about this. Some of these conversations are sensitive, but we've had more and more countries expressing interest in the F-35. And when they look at what's happening with the threats, when they look at how revolutionary an F-35 is compared to fourth-generation aircraft that they might own now, it's really not a hard choice to make.
Okay. This question comes from Jillian Rich of Janes. Can you give any updates on the B-21 bomber schedule in its first flight?
No.
Sorry, Jim.
The program's making progress. The Deputy Secretary of Defense made a comment the other day that it was going well. I never say any program is going well because I've seen too many programs get into trouble, and it hasn't had first flight yet. So there's a ways to go in the B-21, but I'm not unhappy with its posture and where it's going. And we're going to be introducing some production money in this year in 23.
Okay. This question is from Valerie Insina of Breaking Defense. How does the Air Force plan on conducting the combat search and rescue mission in war with China after truncating the HH-60W buy?
We've shortened the numbers a significant fraction, actually. And that's because when we look at the operational needs, whether it's Europe or the Pacific, we don't think that platform is appropriate for all the things that we would have to do or at the level of inventory that we were originally intended. And one of the things, if we talk about a Taiwan or a Pacific scenario, we're likely to have either a very dense threat environment where it's hard for that aircraft to survive, or one where it's over the water, for example, where there aren't any threats to deal with, and it's relatively easy to recover somebody. So we think a better mix is to not buy that aircraft in the same quantities and use some other capabilities to augment it to give us what we need overall and save some money.
Okay. Can you elaborate on other capabilities?
Conventional helicopters. It's an expensive helicopter because of the modifications and so on to it for the mission.
Okay. This question is from Stephen Losey, air warfare reporter for Defense News. What is it going to take to get the Aero hypersonic weapon back on the road to procurement? You seem to be returning it to RDT&E with that process. What do you want to see before the Air Force starts procuring Aero? Is it going to be a matter of successful tests, getting it off the rails, something beyond that? What are you looking at?
It's essentially a successful test. It's had 3 failures now. We're funding it for R&D in the 23 budget. We want to see some evidence of success before we make a procurement decision.
Okay. Can you elaborate on what that evidence of success is going to look like to you?
Not beyond successful testing. That'll do for the moment, I think.
All right. And relatedly, from Tony Capaccio of Bloomberg, Aero was supposed to be declared by September 30th to be the U.S.'s first hypersonic weapon, albeit with just an early operational capability. Now that goal has slipped into sometime in fiscal 2023, if at all, because of 3 test failures. How critical are the next booster and full-up missile tests to the program's survival? And what's the current schedule? And at what point does the program get canceled if the schedule strings out for months more because of more failures?
We're looking at our hypersonics portfolio in general. There was a lot of enthusiasm for hypersonics in the previous administration, and I'm convinced that they're going to be part of our inventory in the future. I don't think that they're going to replace all of our conventional weapons by any means. Hypersonics bring certain characteristics to the table. They're fast, which means they get someplace more quickly than other weapons might. They're very hard to defend against. They're also very expensive. And so we have to look at what the right mix is. And in general, I think that they're a relatively smaller inventory, select purpose weapon, more so than a broad inventory, broad purpose. And part of the reason of that is cost effectiveness. I mentioned that they're very expensive. Over time, people will develop effective defenses against them. The reason those defenses don't exist is because there's been no need until now. And we're working and others are working on defenses against them. But it's also the target set that we're concerned about and what's most appropriate for given targets. China has invested pretty heavily in hypersonics, and they've done a lot of different types of systems for different reasons. But the target set that we present to China is not the target set that China presents to us. I mentioned defeating aggression and mobile targets in particular that we want to deal with. China has a lot of fixed targets that may be defended against which hypersonics can be appropriate. We don't have exactly the mirror image of what they have.
Okay. This question is also from Steve Losi. You've spoken about the importance of manned and unmanned teaming, and at AFA in March, you said, we're looking for systems that cost nominally on the order of at least half as much as the manned systems that we're talking about, both for NGAD, am I saying that right, and for B-21. You also said that you're looking for attritable drones for this, at least in some cases. But those platforms like B-21 and even F-35, if you're eyeing that as potentially a drone wingman, are very expensive. So how does a price tag of about half as much square with the idea of an attritable drone wingman?
When you bring uncrewed combat aircraft in the equation, you open up a whole raft of new tactics that wouldn't be available if all your platforms were manned. For example, you can send one of these aircraft forward for the purpose of drawing fire, knowing that it's going to be expended. And so it's attributable in that sense. It's sacrificed in a way. It's like a move in chess where you put a pawn out forward, right? You let it be captured because that reveals the enemy's positions and it allows them, and he expends a bunch of munitions at the same time. So you can do things like that. That's just the opening thought about what can be done with uncrewed combat capabilities. There are a number of other things you can do. If we don't get the cost down, it's going to be hard to justify doing it. And it's a necessity to me to do that. If you look at the cost of our tactical aircraft that we're buying F-35 at about $80 million a copy. We're buying F-15EX at about $80 million a copy. And we're talking about buying NGAD, which is significantly more expensive than those aircraft. If those are my only choices to populate the force structure of the U.S. Air Force, I will never modernize the U.S. Air Force. It just isn't going to happen. So we've got to introduce some things that are lower cost into the equation.
Okay. I'm going to jump over to a couple space questions for you, space and cyber. This question is from Courtney Alban of C4ISRNet. Beyond investments in missile warning and tracking architectures, where else do we see a move toward more resilient space architectures in the 23 budget?
Almost all of our capabilities in space need to be more resilient. That includes the capabilities of the intelligence community. And we're working very closely with the National Reconnaissance Office in particular, who does our certain types of sensors for the country from space, to ensure that we've met all of the joint requirements operationally as well as the intelligence community's requirements. So that's one area in particular where we're working very hard. But if you look at things like GPS, PNT, position, navigation, and timing, relatively small number of satellites there in predictable orbits right now too, as well as potential for jamming we have to worry about. So that has to be more resilient. Our communications in general have to be more resilient. We've started down that path with Space Development Agency. So the whole range, all the things that we depend upon space for, that we're dependent upon, are potentially targetable by an adversary. And we have to think about how to be more resilient, reconstitutable against a whole variety of threats.
Okay, and also from Courtney, the Space Development Agency is transitioning into the Space Force in October. Are there any loose ends that need to be decided before then? And what kinds of acquisition authorities will the SDA director maintain through that transition?
Yeah, we're well down the path of making that happen. Dirk Turner has been working very closely with us, and we've essentially made him a member of the staff already. He was included, his budget, the SDA budget, is included in our FY23 Department of the Air Force submission. We're treating SDA as a member of the family already, if you will. So they're fully involved in all the activities of the staff. And we want to have as seamless a transition as possible. So I'm hoping there aren't any, quote, loose ends. We're working some of the personnel transition issues and some of the administrative bureaucracy things that we have to do. And I think we'll get those all sorted out. I think we're in pretty good shape right now to make that happen. The thing that I need, that I don't have yet, and I need Congress's help on this, is a space acquisition executive. We've nominated Frank Kendall to do that job. Terrific candidate. He hasn't been confirmed yet. He's been through his hearing, but not confirmed. And I really need him on board. I would hope that the Congress would move on that soon.
Okay, great. Vice President Kamala Harris announced a new commitment not to conduct destructive direct assault anti-satellite missile testing. And the U.S. seeks to establish this as a new international norm of behavior in space. From your perspective as senior leader of the U.S. Space Force, how important is freedom of movement in space for the joint military community and the world at large?
I think it's terribly important for both. We need to be able to provide the services that we provide from space. There are a whole host of an exploding number of commercial companies operating in space that need to have freedom to operate there. Our economies are all to some extent dependent upon services that we get from space. You know, the internet, you know, things that we depend upon and use every day. So obviously not creating debris is important. The Russians just did a very irresponsible test where they created an enormous amount of debris. It surprised us that they did that because technically it wasn't necessary for them to do that. And so the U.S. was not about to do an act like that anyway. But we wanted to be more clear in this norm about what the standards are, and hopefully we'll get international support for this and a ban on that kind of a test.
Okay. I'm going to dive into some personnel questions. We focused a lot on procurement, acquisition, development.
Sure.
The competition for highly skilled people to serve in the modern military is always a significant challenge. So how is recruiting and retention going for the Air Force and the Space Force?
It's a little bit of a challenge. The Space Force doesn't have an issue because it's so small. The Space Force is, by the end of the year, going to be about 8,500 people. Okay. So that's a relatively small force. The active Air Force is about 330. So that's 330,000. And then, of course, the Guard and Reserves as well. So that's a much bigger force to recruit for. The job market right now has enormous demand for labor out there. And so the competition we have with the commercial market has gone up. We're also working very, very hard to increase diversity, particularly in the operational side of the Air Force. We've got a number of outreach programs to do that. The last time I looked at the numbers, which was just a few days ago, we think we'll be okay for this year. We're not concerned about being below our numbers, although it's a little bit of a challenge. But I think in the following year we might have more difficulties. So we're trying to think ahead and put some things in place that'll help us throughout. We've got some bonus programs. We're reaching out to organizations that we haven't reached out to traditionally as much as we have, could possibly, and we're trying to involve more of our structure in recruiting in one way or the other, encouraging young people to come in. It's an exciting time and I think an important time to be part of our military. So hopefully we'll be all right there. I'm not at a point where I'm overly concerned yet, but there are some cautions about where we are, and we're taking some steps to try to get ahead of that.
Why are you anticipating more difficulty in the coming year in terms of recruiting?
We have kept a backlog of people waiting to come in,
okay.
And one of the things we're doing this year is absorbing some of that backlog. Okay. So we won't have that option next year.
Okay. Elaborating a little bit more in detail on recruitment of people of various backgrounds. So 11% of the officers in the Army are African American, but as of February 10th, 2022, only 6% of the officers in the Air Force are African American. As you may also know, of the 14,000 pilots in the Air Force, less than 300 of its pilots, that's just 2% of its pilots, are African American. Why is there such a disparity along with other apparent inequalities in the Air Force's disciplinary system exist, and what can be done to remedy these institutional inequities?
Yeah, we did a number of studies last year that looked at disparity in various categories in the Air Force, and we highlighted some of the things like you just described. The shortfall in African Americans, for example, black people in operational side, pilots, has been there for a long time. We don't have that same shortfall in some of the other fields. So we're trying to understand root causes here, but we're also trying to do a lot more outreach to these groups to try to encourage them and help them get ready to come in and serve in some of those capacities. Some of it's internal cultural, I think, to be quite honest. But it's also about the steps we take to recruit people and bring them in. And then what we do to retain them. So we want to understand fully why people are leaving, so we can address some of those issues. I was briefed a few months ago by Blue Star families on some studies they had done about how families felt about being in the Air Force and assigned to certain bases and so on. And we learned some really interesting things from that. An interesting story is how an officer who was a four-star general, retired, talked about how he had been on a base in a very northern western state, and he couldn't get a haircut on base because they didn't know how to cut African American or black people's hair. He had to drive an hour to find a barber who knew how to cut his kind of hair. That shouldn't have to happen, but it's one of those minor things that irritates people, and they tend to accumulate, unfortunately.
Okay, all right. Last Thursday, it was reported that following a lengthy investigation, the Air Force Academy had identified 245 cadets suspected of cheating, 231 of whom had admitted to cheating, 210 of whom were placed on probation and given a customary 6-month suspension, and that 22 cadets were expelled from the academy. What does this say about the ethics of such a large number of cadets who had no problem with cheating? And will the Academy continue to use virtual instruction and testing, which might compromise Air Force Academy cadets' honor and integrity in the future?
I'm an Academy grad at a different academy, West Point. There have been a lot of changes in all the Academy's honor systems over the years, and a lot of interest in this. I spent a lot of time talking to Rich Clark, the Lieutenant General Clark, who's the commandant, the superintendent of the Air Force Academy. What we try to do now with people when they commit a violation is see if they can be, the culture of honesty and integrity can be better inculcated into them. It used to be a one mistake and you were out automatically. We don't take that approach anymore, and I think that's probably a positive change. People that come in from the current culture don't have the same value system that people might have had 50 years or so ago when I came in. That's just a fact of life. And to a surprising extent, we have to help these young people appreciate the importance of integrity, the importance of honor, the importance of not cheating on a test. Many of them have come from a world in which cheating on a test is what a lot of people do. So when we think we can work with people and we can move them forward and ingrain those values in them, then we try to do that. And that's what's happened, I think, in this case. And some of the people, quite clear that wasn't going to be effective or get the desired result. In those cases, some people had to be separated without that opportunity. In other cases, we're trying to work with them and help them move forward.
Okay. As you may know, the court-martial of General Bill Cooley at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for sexual harassment was postponed from January 10th until yesterday, April 18th. In your view, what is the significance of that case, which is the first time that the Air Force has prosecuted a general on a sexual harassment charge?
I tell you what, I don't think I should comment on a specific case like that. First of all, it's ongoing, and I don't want to be seen as having any bearing on that proceedings that are going on. We work very hard in the Air Force to address sexual harassment. You see, I'm wearing my and the Undersecretary and I have spent a lot of time on this. We've dealt with a couple of very controversial cases directly, not this one. And we're trying to assure that the standard is there and that people understand what it is and they follow it. And that we do not tolerate sexual assault or sexual harassment. That's a work in progress. We still have progress to make there. When we did our analyses of where people were and what they'd experienced, there were far too many incidents. Even though the sample wasn't representative, it was still too high a numbers of people who were having this kind of experience. And I talked to the Under the other day about this, and I said, there's still a lot of people out there who have attitudes that they shouldn't have anymore, that my generation might have had as routine. We got to change that.
Yesterday, the Air Force's first ever chief architect, Preston Dunlap, announced his resignation. Will you pick a successor to fill the chief architect job, or will you eliminate the position? If the former, what should the chief architect do?
I'm looking at that right now. Preston's done a good job for us, and it's been good to have him on the staff. I haven't had a chance to say goodbye to him. He'll be coming by, and I hope having lunch with me here in the next few days. What I'm looking at right now is an organizational structure that is closer to being a program management type of structure, which has design responsibilities and management responsibilities for the collection of the Air Force's C3 battle management modernization programs. We don't quite have that structure right now. Once upon a time, we had systems commands, which had that kind of a responsibility. And with the current program executive officer and PM structure, organizations get to manage individual programs. And so but we don't have someone who's in charge of the overall design of these things that have to tie together and perform functions as a whole. And I think we need to create something that has more of that kind of responsibility. Haven't even decided what we might call it yet, but we want to move in that direction. The Navy's done something similar for their overmatch program, for their JADC² approach. And we think that's a pretty good model, so we're probably going to do something that looks a little bit more like that.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more quick question before I close things out. So I'm just going to jump back to some questions I had left out earlier related to space and cyber. The threat of cyber attacks affects the operations of all aspects of life, from banking to travel and other forms of daily commerce. So how does the U.S. Air Force and the Space Force work with other military branches to defeat cyber attacks and develop capabilities to defend, even launch attacks to disrupt potential enemies?
Yeah, we work collectively on a number of areas. We work on establishing standards that can be uniform across the services. Cyber Command has overarching responsibility, and under that, each of the military departments and services has allocated certain responsibilities. That's something that I think we need to revisit kind of constantly to see how it's going. Most of the time, if you look at a joint operations center, for example, all the services are present, even in ones like an air operations center, right? Our key command and control center. You have interfaces there to lots of other organizations that has to be managed. And then you have the whole hierarchy of systems that are below that. So I think it is a widely understood and appreciated for its importance area. And I do think we've made a lot of progress there, but we still have a long way to go. One of the things that I've talked to the leadership in OSD about is the need for more technical oversight, if you will, standardization management, design control, if you will, from the Secretary of Defense's office. So it's just to help the services kind of force them to work together in a way. And we used to have an organization called ASD, Assistant Secretary of Defense for C3I. It was abolished a long time ago, and I think when that happened, we lost some of that technical program management leadership from OSD, and I think in one form or another we need to recreate that. And the Deputy Secretary and I have had, Deputy Secretary of Defense and I have had conversations about this, and I think she's moving in that direction already. Okay,
great. Before we conclude today's discussion, let me take a moment to thank Headliners co-team leaders Donna Leinwin-Legere and Lori Russo, the Headliners team member who organized today's event, Kevin Winsting, in the audience over here, as well as Club Communications Director Kate Helster and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. And now for the last question. What's the best Air Force featured or showcased movie you have ever seen? We're going to end on a fun
Well, it's probably Army Air Corps, actually. But I just came yesterday. I was at the, I have to mention this one. I was at the 80th anniversary of the, I'll get emotional talking about this. The last goblet turning for the Doolittle Raiders. The last Doolittle Raider died in 2019. His name is Dick Cole. He was Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot. Mm-hmm. And his children were there, along with descendants of almost all the families of the crew members. And we had an event where they have 80 goblets, one for each person. And over the years, as people passed away, They have a ceremony on the anniversary of the raid where they turn over the goblets for the people who passed away and drink a toast. And I got to lead the toast yesterday. It was really memorable and moving for me. But 30 Seconds Over Tokyo would be on the list. But the first movie that came to my mind was A Guy Named Joe.
Okay.
They're both Spencer Tracy movies, if I remember correctly.
All right.
But anyway, they're old. I'm an old movie buff, so there you go.
I will have to check those out, and this is nothing compared to the Doolittle Raiders goblets, but here is a National Press Club mug for you. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. What a neat